we continue with James, please.
Okay, hi everyone. I had a couple of ideas for this, but the one that I've gone for today is entitled Midwest Eurasianism and Edward Bernays Propaganda Model. Okay. So in his 2020 book, The War for Eternity, Benjamin Teitelbaum interviewed President Trump's former chief strategist Steve Bannon and Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin to outline the impact of traditionalist philosophies on American politics. In this essay, I want to critique Bernays' propaganda model by arguing that the general US voter has their own intellectual autonomy and holds opinions that escape capture by either Bannon or comparative liberal pundits. As recounted by Teitelbaum, in his 1997 book, Foundations of Geopolitics, the famous or infamous philosopher Alexander Dugin outlines his concept of Eurasianism, arguing that while Russia's huge landmass insulates the population from outsiders and outside ideas, leading to a homogeneous and conservative way of being, Dugin draws heavily on Martin Heidegger's concept of Dasein. The Atlantic nations, due to their seagoing nature, want to spread their ideas and power across the world. This is especially true of the United States, Dugin asserts, because a country of, as he sees it, rootless immigrants whom pledge allegiance to supposedly universal values such as liberty and democracy is imperiled in its very being to universalize itself in its own image across the world, by force if necessary. Although arriving at similar conclusions from his own independent reading of the key traditionalist thinkers René Guénon, Julius Evola, and George Gurdjieff, not sure if I'm scrambling that pronunciation, but Bannon found much in common with Dugin's thinking when they met in Rome in 2018. And Dugin applied this analysis, Bannon applied this analysis to the American heartland. Much as for Dugin, the Russian peasantry's tilling of the earth gives it a direct spiritual connection to an eternal Russianness. For Bannon, the American heartland constitutes what we might call a blue-collar metaphysics. Inverting the spiritual hierarchy of traditional traditionalists, with their preference for a priestly caste at the top and dismissal of the masses as slaves both to their betters and masters and to their physical appetites. Bannon argues that the American working class's position right on the bleeding edge of survival gives them an embodied wisdom that no elite education ever could. It is liberalism, or more specifically the concept of the US as an idea, Bannon argues, that universalizing urge to remake the world in the United States image, that is so dangerous to the American heartland and leads to the outsourcing of jobs and engagement in overseas wars. Having outlined their positions above, it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to imagine that if both Bannon and Dugin were to read even just the first two lines of pioneering public relations expert Edward Bernays' propaganda, with its claim that, quote, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling of our country. They might find much to agree with. However, despite Bannon's claims that the American heartland is naturally conservative, the problem here is that when one actually looks into what most Americans believe about hot-button political and cultural issues, it appears that neither conservatives nor liberals, for that matter, get their own way. For example, opinion polls are taken by the Pew Research Center in June this year, and yes, we need to bear in mind the propagandistic role of opinion polls in shaping opinion rather than just reflecting it. Nevertheless show that while 60% of US voters believe that sex is determined by the gender one is assigned at birth, and 54% of Americans believe that gun ownership increases public safety by allowing individuals to protect themselves. On the other hand, 59% of Americans believe that undocumented migrants should be allowed to stay in the US, and 66% of Americans are opposed to an outright ban on abortion. Where this autonomy comes from is beyond the purview of this essay. Merely to note that it exists and to argue that if Bannon were to claim that the more liberal positions articulated above is evidence of a Bernaysian manipulation of the masses by the elite liberal media, this would only serve to undermine his own arguments about the inherent wisdom of the American heartland and recapitulate patronizing arguments, sometimes coming from a Marxist perspective regarding the false consciousness of the proletariat. Since neither side seems to get what they want in these issues, maybe the wisdom of the American heartland transcends both left and right. The end.
Thank you very much, James. Very fascinating stuff. The end part, I think, is also very important to note. The question of what are the limits of power? What are the limits of control? Like, to what extent is this paradigm of control just another kind of illusion? And there's an essay that by William Burroughs, I think, called "The Limits of Control." That was also what inspired Deleuze to write his postscript on the societies of control. It's also something to recommend there, because just like computation, simulating something by computation takes more resources than having the real thing. Controlling something takes more resources than not controlling it, right? It's always it kind of explodes in the costs, in its cost of controlling things, and at some point it's just collapses on itself. It doesn't become it's no longer viable. Yeah. So yeah, interesting critique. I guess it's kind of a propaganda versus propaganda kind of thing, right? It's there seems to be a weakness in the dominant propaganda. Arguably, that's the way I would put it, is like that woke is nothing other than the propaganda kind of having become less plausible as the enemy has become less plausible. At times where there was a real kind of remnant of a, let's say, white Western colonial structure, when there was such structure still in place, for example, around the civil rights movement and all that, the ideologies were more plausible, so to say. Once the enemy has kind of been defeated, these ideologies become less plausible, and at that point, I think the natural wisdom of the people kind of wakes up to the implausibility. Would you agree with that notion, or what do you think of that point?
Yeah, that sounds at least a plausible argument that sort of wants, can't phrase this technically, but I know what you mean. Once the kind of the low hanging fruit of being dealt with, it kind of shifts into overdrive because I suppose it becomes kind of asymmetric.
Yeah, and it identifies its enemy everywhere, right? Then, like, in the way that Adorno identified fascism everywhere, then the fascism and all of the white colonial patriarchal structures are found in every place, and at some point it kind of becomes self-devouring to some extent. Yeah, I tied it into Adorno, but I also want to tie it into the music aspect we spoke of earlier. You mentioned Guénon, Gurdjieff, and Evola. I can actually recommend some of the piano pieces by Gurdjieff. As far as I know, he never learned how to read notes, so they're all like kind of very intuitive pieces. But yeah. Anyone else have any questions?
So, James, so presumably your talk would be then a call to depoliticize society somewhat, do you think? Because really both sides are claiming truths which are very dodgy. And so maybe it's a call to step back from political dialogue somewhat, and well, we see what happened this morning or yesterday, was it? Would you agree?
I suppose what I was trying to get at with there is not so much depoliticizing or repoliticizing it. It was more trying to think about, okay, so where do people get their ideas from? I do think there is a genuine autonomy that the general public have, which is not just one side of propaganda or the other. I do. Well, if you want to put it this way, I do. I think there's a common sense, but I don't think either side gets what it wants. That's the point that I'm trying to make. I would go along with Bannon and say yes, there is a kind of a common sense that's that's different for each country, but it doesn't pan out nicely to the left or the right. I suppose that's was what I was trying to say. And if you try and claim common sense as one side or the other, you're going to be left disappointed.
Mm.
I mean, Christopher, sorry, Peter Hitchens. I don't know if people in the US know Peter Hitchens. Is Christopher Hitchens' younger brother, and he talks about, in a British context, how again a lot of liberal or left opinion is out of sync with the general public. Let's say, the general public tend to, which is why the Conservatives are generally so successful in over the centuries, is because the general public tend to like low taxation. They tend to be, very patriotic. They tend to favour being tough on crime, which the Conservatives do. But then they also, in a British context, tend to be very against guns. Because the British public don't have a right to bear arms. They tend to be more left wing in terms of taxation, wanting high taxation. So that just to throw those things out there and not even have an answer to that, to think, I don't know, where is this common sense genuine? Is it due to like this lived experience where people, who wouldn't ordinarily think about politics, but through their lived experience have a kind of wisdom, but it's not easy left or right. So I know that doesn't quite get to, whether we politicize or not, but I suppose I would say it's a bit of a depoliticization because we're trying to get to what people actually think rather than being ideologues.
Mm.
And at the same time, I don't just mean sort of a boring centrism, which takes a bit from each.
Yeah.
I suppose I'm advocating for preventing capture by either side.
Mm. But ultimately, you have to put your cross somewhere and make a decision, don't you? But yeah, the stuff they're saying is maybe a bit ephemeral too. I know
Yeah.
Deleuze said that common sense sort of goes backwards and forwards in two directions if it's a sort of bi-directional thing, and the truth which upheld common sense neither went forwards nor backwards. Yeah.
It also ties into this idea that power can mold ideologies, and takes parts of them as it sees fit. And in the sense, no political ideology has been ever implemented like a recipe. Potentially you could say the best efforts were the Bolsheviks or something like that, but even there you'll always find compromises with the power structure, with the circumstances of a certain society. And it's also important to note that, that there's that inherent limitation of this kind of political thought there. And you often get that with ideologues, that they'll say, yes, but that wasn't real XYZ, that wasn't real communism, that wasn't real capitalism, that wasn't real. Essentially, if you dig down to it, a lot of it, if not most of the stuff people advocate for, has been tried to some extent, but it hasn't been tried to their in their taste to the right extent, and so they can always argue for it regardless. But yeah, anyone else have any questions for Andrew? Sorry, for James. For James.
I think one of the issues is that like you could totally have a society with a Heartland people and a city dwelling people that were on the same page and that had the same goals. I think at least the problem in America is that those two groups tend to have different goals. And it's not about common sense. What they see as common sense is simply the things that they take as axiomatic for the support of their goals. And so that's really where they come to blows. People in the Heartland are kind of just like, we just want to be kind of left alone. We like living simple lives. And, as long as we have that, we're pretty non-confrontational. And, we're not out to like convert anybody to any specific thing. And, but they're looked down on because they don't have any ideological reach beyond those kind of basic goals. And, but you could totally, I mean, if you could make peace across those lines, you could totally have a class of people who had more sophisticated understanding of the goals of a civilization and produce the more sophisticated art that would still appeal to the Heartlanders who could look at that and see it and respect it. And at the same time, I think Heartlanders, they have to interact with the brute facts of reality a lot more than say people who live in ivory towers or in the cities. And so, I think evolutionary selection probably is a little bit more rough on Heartlanders because, they are the ones who strap rockets to their cars and drive them into the side of cliffs, because, hey, why not? Let's give it a, but they have a more martial kind of mindset when it comes to reality. And there's a lot of value in that. Like there's a lot of resilience in that. And if you have both sides of that coin appreciating what the others had because they have the same goals, like that's really the important thing, I think. Then what they perceived as common sense, I think, would be more united. And we just like in the US, we're just at the point where that's not the case. Like there's not one set of goals, like at all. And so you could argue that we're not really a nation, that we're just LARPing as one. And yeah, but I appreciate your analysis of that, though.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I mean, I'd argue that mass media has also a role to play in this because I feel like before the kind of rapid expansion of it, people could kind of like feel like the others are far away. I mean, the US is a huge country, especially from the perspective of someone in Europe. It's a huge country, and I feel like through mass media, all of these people, all of these like coastal elites just feel much closer. They feel like they're imposing their ideas on you much harder with mass media than if there was just slow media in comparison and they were just far away at the coast and we are like miles and miles away in our state here.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems that this conflict between the rural, the provincial, and the metropolitan, the city, is this distinction that Spengler highlighted in Der Untergang des Abendlandes. He said there will be a conflict between the customs of the city dwellers and the customs of the rurals and the agricultural societies, and I think that that's shown in Mao's attempt to try to convert, if I can use that term, the peasant culture of China. They resisted the most because they were the most removed, and they hadn't even heard of the doctrines that he had adopted or appropriated from Russia. And then in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the same problem with the gulags and the people that are living, agricultural simplistic lives. They're not interested in joining the party because their needs aren't the same. As Nicholas has said, they don't have shared interests, and you can't convince them no matter what because it's in conflict with their life, their way of living.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for your comments, Nicholas and Dawson.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this first round of talks.